And I also hope that you had a good day. All right, so for today or tonight, we will be doing our grade 5 English lesson on adverbs. So we're going to be doing a grade 5 English lesson on adverbs. And before we start with our lesson, we're going to log into the aplusstudents.ca. Then we're going to select the subject of language arts, grade 5. Now, once we are in grade 5, right, we're going to scroll down up until we get to adverbs. So we're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of adverbs, right? Adverbs. And under the chapter adverbs, we are going to focus on the lesson of identify adverbs. So we're going to identify adverbs, right? So we're doing the chapter of adverbs, and the lesson that we are focusing on is to identify adverbs. All right. Now we're going to what an adverb is. So we're going to first start with what an adverb is, and then from there we will move on to more examples also of adverbs. All right. So an adverb, right? So an adverb is a word that tells you more about a verb. So an adverb is a word that tells you more about a verb, right? It tells you either how, or it tells you when, or it tells you where, right? So that is an adverb. So an adverb, it tells you more about the verb, and it tells you how, when, or where, right? So some of the adverbs, right, that tells you how, they usually end in ly. So adverbs that tells you how, they usually end in ly. For example, how does she run? And then we can say she runs quickly. So of course the sentence would be she runs quickly. Then you need to ask yourself the question, how does she run? Because now it answers or basically tells you how, when, or where. So how does she run? She runs quickly. So quickly is in our adverb, right? Then some of the adverbs tells us when, right? When does he leave? He leaves soon, right? So remember, he leaves soon is, for example, the sentence where we have to identify the adverb, right? So he leaves soon. Then you need to ask yourself the question, when does he leave? And then we can say soon. So soon being our adverb that tells us when. Then some adverbs that tell us where, right? So they tell us where. Where do they play? They play outside. So this will be maybe our given sentence where we need to identify the adverb, and then you need to ask yourself the question, where do they play? And then you can maybe say, or not say, but you can identify outside, because that is where they play. So they either play outside, they play inside, for example, right? And that is but a few examples of adverbs, right? And we said adverbs, it's a word that tells you more about the verb, and it tells us how, it tells us when, or it even tells us when, where, how, when, and where, right? And the adverbs that tells us how, these usually end in ly, right? So quickly, hurriedly, surprisingly, right? So that tells us how. All right. Mm-mm-mm. They're not giving us the. All right. So now, also with adverbs, right? Let us go to our white page. So, adverb. So, once again, an adverb, it describes a verb. So, an adverb not only just tells us or describes a verb, but an adverb also describes or tells us about an adjective or another adverb, right? And like we said, it tells us how, it tells us when, it tells us when, it tells us where, it tells us when. It also tells us how much, and it can also tell us to what frequency or with what frequency, right? And an adverb can tell how, right? And when an adverb tells us how, then we can maybe use words like it can either tell us quietly, peacefully, carefully, slowly, badly, closely, easily. They can either tell us well, fast, quickly, and cheerfully. That is now a few adverbs that tells us how, right? Then even adverb tells us where, right? Then it can basically tell us, like for example, where. It doesn't necessarily have to be a name of a city. It can maybe just tell you, for example, things like above, right? Or on top, or below, abroad. She lives abroad. Doesn't have to necessarily say she lives in New York City, right? So we can just say she lives abroad. Far, away, back, here, outside, backwards, behind, below, and down. That is but a few examples of adverbs that tells us where. Then we have adverbs that tells us when. When, right? If it tells us when, then it can be, for example, now, yesterday, soon, later, enormously. Sorry, now, yesterday, soon, later, tomorrow, yet, already, tonight, today, then, last year, right? So that is adverbs that tells us when. Then we also have adverbs that tells us how much or how often, but we don't really use that one as much, right? But if adverbs tell us how much, then we can say, for example, quite, fairly, too, enormously, entirely, very, extremely, rather, almost, absolutely, and just. Right? So that is adverbs that tells us how much. And then we have adverbs that tells us how often, right? So if it tells us how often, then it's either always, sometimes, often, frequently, no, normally, generally, usually, occasionally, seldom, rarely, or never, right? So that is but a few examples of adverbs, right? And once again, an adverb It describes a verb, an adverb, or it can describe an adjective, right? And it tells us how, when, or where, right? Can also tell us how much, and it also can tell us to what frequency, right? But the most important ones, so the ones that we mainly use, let's put it like that, the ones that we mainly use are adverbs that either tells us how, where, and when, right? All right. So here again, we have a few examples of adverbs that either tells us how, when, where, how often, and how much, right? So how. Adverbs, once again, that tells us how, right? So, for example, we have quietly, easily, carefully, well, slowly, badly, right? So, that is just but a few examples again, like we made mention of. And now we can, if we look maybe at not necessarily a sentence, but yes, part of it, right? Where we will be able to identify adverbs, then it is maybe where we can say, maybe adverbs of how that tells us how can be like talk quietly. So quietly being the adverb that tells us how, right? Sarah drove slowly, right? So which means that slowly that tells us how Sarah drove. She examined the box carefully. So it's like asking yourself, how did she examine the box? Then we can say carefully, right? Then we have adverbs that tells us when, right? And we made a few examples of when. So we can either say leave now. So now tells us when. Post the parcel today. So when should I post the parcel? Today. Or Tony left yesterday can be yesterday or even tomorrow, right? That tells us when. Then we have adverbs that tells us where, right? So we can say bring it here. Where? Here. So here being our adverb that tells us where. Then we have I used to live there. You see, so there, instead of saying, for example, the name of the town, the name of the place, the name of the street, we can maybe just say there, yeah, right? The issues are happening overseas, right? Which means that it is something that's abroad. It is overseas, right? It doesn't necessarily have to say the issues happens in Canada, for example, or in South Africa. We can maybe just say that the issues are happening overseas, right? It basically gives us an idea of where the issues are taking place. And then we have how often, right? How often. So, for example, you always complain. So, how often do you complain? Always. Always being our adverb. Check your work often. Often being how often. Toby sometimes lie. So how often does Toby lie? Sometimes, right? And then we also have how much, right? And we already made a few examples of how much. The rip is extremely noticeable, right? So extremely tells us how much. Don't work too hard. So too, it tells us how much. It is entirely inappropriate. So entirely is or tells us how much, right? And that is but a few of our adverbs, right? And these are once again a few of our adverbs that either tells us how, it tells us when, it tells us where, it tells us how much, and it also tells us how often. So nicely. How? Nicely. How does it speak clearly, right? How often? Often. Very, exactly, well, always, slowly, mostly, to, never, speaking softly, seldom. So these are a few examples, right, added on to the previous examples that we made about adverbs. Now again, back to our tutorial. right? So once again, we said an adverb is a word that tells you more about the verb, and it also tells us how, it tells us when, or it tells us where, right? And we see that some adverbs that tells us how, they usually end in ly, right? So how does she run? She runs quickly. So quickly being our adverb. Quickly, right? Then some adverbs tells you when. When does he leave? He leaves soon. So soon being our adverb. Some adverbs tells you where, right? Where do they play? They play outside. So outside being the adverb that tells us where they are playing. So it's either outside or inside, for example. All right, so now we are going to move on. So we don't have that. Okay, let us go to our test, right? We're going to go to our test. So now we're going to go to our test. And remember, keeping in mind that an adverb, it either tells us or it describes a verb, an adjective, and it also tells us or describes another adverb, right? And adverbs, they either tell us how, they tell us when, they tell us where, can either tell us how often also, right? So we're going to have to select the adverb that tells us about the verb, right? So the crew digs underground. So the crew digs underground. So we need to select the adverb that tells us about the verb, right? So it's like either asking us like where does he dig, right? So where does he dig? So the crew digs underground. We need to select the adverb, right? That tells us about the verb. So what is the verb? If we first identify the verb within that sentence, right, which is digs, right, then we now need to find the word that tells us about the digging, right? So basically, where do they dig? So if we, for example, say where do they dig, then we can say underground. So underground, it tells us where the crew digs. We need to select the adverb that tells us about the verb, right? So the frightened deer pranced away. So the frightened deer pranced away, right? So we need to select the adverb within that sentence. So the frightened deer, right, pranced away, right? So we need to select the adverb. So frightened deer, frightened is an adjective, right? That tells us about the deer, right? Which is a noun. So now select a we need to select a word that tells us about the verb, right? And the verb being pranced, right? It's like he ran away, right? All right. So we can then say, let's choose away. So he pranced away. So pranced being our verb. Gently clean the cut. So gently clean the cut. So how should I clean the cut? Right? So you need to ask yourself either how do I or how should I clean the cut? Right? And remember we said the adverbs that tells us how they end in ly. So the adverbs that tells us how they end in ly. So gently clean the cut. So how should I or how do I clean the cut? So we can say gently clean the cut. So gently being our adverb, gently. The dog quivered silently. The dog quivered silently, right? So we need to select the adverb that tells us about the verb, which is quivered. So now we need to ask ourselves, how does the dog quiver, right? And then we can say, he quivered or it quivered silently. Silently being our adverb. The fog crept everywhere. The fog crept everywhere. We need to select the adverb that tells us about the verb. The fog crept everywhere. So where did the fog creep or crept, right? Because crept being our verb, right? So which means that we can say everywhere being our adverb, right? The famous battle happened here. The famous battle happened here. So where did the famous battle happen? Then we can say it happened here. Because now it's telling us where, right? A baby cried somewhere. A baby cried somewhere. So it's like asking yourself, where did the baby cry? Right? And like we said, it doesn't necessarily have to be a specific place, right? A baby cried somewhere. So where did the baby cry? We can say somewhere. The actors performed downstairs. So the actors perform downstairs. So where did the actors perform? Right? So where did the actors perform? And then we can say the actors performed downstairs. So downstairs being our adverb. That tells us about the verb, right? The two men agree now. So the two men agree now. So when do the two men agree? Remember, these are the questions that we need to ask ourselves. So when do the men agree? And then we can say the men agree now. All right, we're doing the last one. The horse galloped forward. So the horse galloped forward. We need to select the adverb that tells us about the verb. So the horse galloped forward, right? So if we select the adverb within that sentence, right, that tells us about the verb, the horse galloped forward, right? Galloped. being our verb, right? Then we can say forward, right? Because that is how or where the horse galloped forward, right? And then the movie started late. The movie started late. So forward is correct. Movie started late. We need to select the adverb that tells us about the verb, which is started, right? So when did the movie start, right? We need to select our adverb that tells us when the movie started. And we can say the movie started late, right? So late is our adverb that tells us about the verb, right? So that is under the chapter of adverbs where we identified adverbs, right? And we said that adverbs, right? It is a word that tells you more about the verb and it tells you how, it tells us when, and it tells us where, right? And we said some adverbs that tells us how they these adverbs are usually ending ly, right? And we made quite a few examples of adverbs that either tell us how, adverbs that tell us where, adverbs that tell us when, right? All right, let's go to our whiteboard again. All right, so now we're going to do a few examples on where we identify adverbs, right? So the first one says identifying adverbs. We are going to circle the adverbs and underline the verb that they describe. So we're going to circle the adverb and we're going to underline the verbs that they describe. Right? So now, if we look at the first one, the first one says, or number one says, we finally got our grades from the test. So we finally got our grades from the test. We got our grades, we got our marks from the test, right? So we need to circle the adverbs and underline the verb. So if we first identify the verb, right, within the sentence, if we identify the verb first within the sentence, we finally got our grades from the test. So got being our verb from our test. So now we need to circle the adverb. But before we circle the adverb, we are first now going to underline all of the verbs first in the activity. Then we will go back and circle our adverb that either tells us about the verb or that describes the verb, if we should put it in that way. Jack walked his dog to the park quickly. If we identify the verb within that sentence, we will say walk being the verb, right? Something, it's an action. The balloon rose quickly in the sky. So rose being our our verb, right? Because rose and rise, right? We dance merrily around the school yard. So danced being our verb. Lisa watched the ball game closely, right? So we need to select or we need to underline the verb within that sentence. So we can then say watched. So where are we? So watched. The player boldly ran from base to base. So ran being our verb. Ran being a verb. My mom cares deeply about me. So care. I almost ate a rotten apple. So ate being our verb that we have underlined within the sentence. Then Tom plays football outside. So plays. And then the last one is I already finished my homework. So finished. Right? So these are now all of the verbs that we have identified first, right? And after we have identified the verbs, we are now going to circle what the adverbs is within the sentences. And remember, adverbs, it either tells us about the verb or describes the verb, right? So we finally got our grades up. So I'm going to say finally. I'm going to circle finally, right? So finally we got our grades from the test. Jack walked his dog to the park quickly. So how does he walk his dog to the park? Quickly. The balloon arose quickly in the sky. We didn't identify this one. Danced. We danced merrily around the school yard. So how did you dance? Merrily. Lisa watched the ball game closely, right? Closely. The player boldly ran from base to base. So, how did this player run? Boldly. And then my mom cares deeply about me. So, deeply. Oopsie. So, deeply. And then I almost ate a rotten apple, right? So, we can say almost. And then Tom plays football where? Outside. And then I finished my homework. Or I already finished my homework. So we can then say already. So these are but a few examples of us identifying adverbs. So in the sentence, what we did was we identified the verbs which we underlined in red, and then we circled the adverbs using blue, right? And once again, an adverb, it either tells us or describes a verb, it tells us or describes an adjective, and another adverb. So it tells us about the verb, the adjective, as well as the adverb. And some of the adverbs, they tell us how, they tell us when, and they tell us where. All right. Now we're going on to the next one. Before we go to that one, the second one, let's go to how adverbs focus, right? So how adverb focus. So once again, an adverb, it describes a verb, it tells us about an adjective or another adverb, right? And an adverb, it gives us information about the way something is done. So, for example, we calmly walked towards the fire exit. So, calmly being our adverb that tells us about how we walked, right? Calmly describes how we walked. Then, look at number one, accidentally spilled water on the table. So, accidentally probably being the adverb and spilled being the verb, right? Now we're going to the next one. Cam politely bowed to his grandparents. So, bowed being a verb. And now we need to find a word. Now we need to find a word that describes you. What's happening? Oh. Now we need to find a word that describes our verb, which is bowed. So now we need to know, how did he bow? He bowed politely. So politely being our adverb, which we're going to try and circle. Right? So how did he bow? He bowed politely. Right? We patiently waited for our turn to go on the ride. So waited is a verb. Right? So now we need to find the adverb that tells us about our verb. And then we can say, how did he wait? He waited patiently. And then the ants busily gathered food for the winter. Right? So the ants busily gathered. So gathered being our verb. And then busily tells us how they gathered food for the winter. So they were busily up and down carrying food, right? And then she danced beautifully to the song. So danced. And then we can say beautifully being our adverb. And then the knight fought bravely and won the battle. So how did the knight fight or fought? Bravely. And then the koala draped lazily around the tree branch. So draped being our verb and lazily telling us how he draped around the tree branch, which is our adverb, right? So so far this is adverbs that tell us how. So in on this page we basically only did adverbs that tells us how, right? And we see that adverbs, it describes verbs, it describes adjectives, or it describes another or tells us about another adverb, right? And an adverb, it gives us information about the way something is done, right? So it's like information that we get that tells us how something is done, right? And then we used a few examples, not examples of us identifying either the adverb within a sentence, or we identified first the verb. Sometimes it can be tricky, right? It can be tricky. And whenever it is tricky, try to first identify, let's say, for example, like in this case with adverbs. So if adverb seems a bit tricky, or let's say a bit difficult or challenging, and then try to first identify the verbs, and then you can find the other words that tells us about the verb, right? So that really happens, or it really works. All right, now we're going on to relative adverbs, right? So this is probably going to be our last one. So here it says that we need to fill in the blanks with the relative adverbs, and we're going to choose the correct adverb within the bracket, and then we're going to write it within the correct sentence, right? And once again, an adverb, it describes a verb, it describes an adjective, or an adverb, right? And it gives us information about the way something is done, right? And we said that adverbs, they either tells us how, it tells us where, or it tells us when, right? So those are adverbs. So now we're going to write the relative adverbs by choosing the correct word in bracket, right? So call me, is it why or when you get home, right? So we're going to choose one of these words. So call me, oops, I'm gonna make it bigger. Yeah. So call me when or why you get home, right? So which means that we're going to say, call me when you get home, right? So call me when you get home. The island is located, right? Is it where the sun never shines, or the island is located wherever the sun never shines, right? So we're going to say it is located where the sun never shines. I don't know. So I don't know, is it where she went or wherever she went? So I don't know where she went. Where? And I don't know, is it why you can be so happy all the time? Or I don't know how you can be so happy all the time. So we need to choose the correct one. I don't know how, or I don't know why you can be so happy all the time. So I don't know how you can be so happy all the time, right? So we need to choose one of those. I was surprised. Is it how quickly the food ran out, or whenever? So we can say, I was surprised how quickly the food ran out. And then, is it wherever you go, there will be people who don't like you, or who you go, there will be people who don't like you. So, of course, wherever you go. So wherever you go, there will always be people that don't like you, right? And then the last one is it whenever I travel, I like to take lots of pictures, or what I travel. So we can say wherever I travel, I like to take lots of pictures. All right. So that is basically identifying adverbs, right? So what we did was we identified adverbs, and we also basically explained what an adverb is, right? Because we said an adverb, it tells us or describes either the verb or an adjective or another adverb, right? And adverbs they either tell us how, when, or where. Right. So now this is the end of our lesson on adverbs and identifying adverbs. Thank you very much for joining the lesson. Um, you should have an amazing evening further. Good night.